Hello again. Welcome back to the second part of our set of tutorials on the vestibular system. In this tutorial, I'd like to speak to you about central processing. This tutorial will again emphasize the complexity of the human brain, and now as we get into the brainstem and to other stations of processing of vestibular information, we will be talking again about circuitry that is genetically determined, and it will form the foundation of the functions of the vestibular system and its impact on motor control systems. My learning objectives for you in this session are that I want you to be able to discuss the neuroanatomy and the function of one particular circuit that is very important in the operation of our vestibular system, and that's called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And as we'll see, the vestibular system are very influential in stabilizing the movements of the eyes in our orbits. I want you to be able to characterize the contributions of the vestibulospinal projections in postural control. Another very important aspect of vestibular function is to stabilize our posture when the surface underneath our feet is moving. And lastly, I want you to be able to discuss the contributions of vestibular sensation to proprioception. So let me once again provide a brief overview of vestibular function. The vestibular labyrinth is an extension of the inner ear that's designed to sense the motions that arise from head movements and the inertial effects due to gravity. There are really two parts to this vestibular system. There are the otolith organs, and these sense static head position and linear accelerations of the head. Then there are the semicircular canals, and the canals sense rotational accelerations, and within both kinds of membranous organs, there are hair cells, and the deflection of the stereocilia of these hair cells is what accomplishes sensory transduction in these different divisions of the vestibular labyrinth. So in this tutorial, I really want to focus on what happens next. So the vestibular signals are relayed to integrative centers in the brainstem as well as in the cerebellum. And these signals are used to adjust postural reflexes and eye movements. These signals also reach parts of the parietal cortex where our normal sense of orientation in three-dimensional space is constructed. This is an important contributor to our body schema. That is, our understanding of the position of our body and its movements in the environment. Now, we also might have vestibular dysfunction from time to time, or perhaps as a result of injury or disease. And that vestibular dysfunction can lead to really a devastating sense of dizziness and disequilibrium. We call this vertigo. And these very powerful sensations arise when this circuitry is disturbed, or when the sensory signals are dramatically shifted towards imbalance, even though the body itself may not be moving. And so these sensations are obviously integrated across multiple levels of processing, but ultimately at the level of the cerebral cortex, where these feelings of unease and dizziness are experienced in consciousness. Okay, well, let's now talk about central vestibular processing. So recall that the cells that grow their axons in the 8th cranial nerve are found in Scarpa's ganglia, and these ganglia provide for the communication of sensory signals from the hair cells and the otolith organs and the semicircular canals to the brainstem. So these Scarpa ganglion cells grow axons that proceed into the brainstem along the path of the 8th cranial nerve. And as they attach to the brainstem in the lateral part of the junctional region between the pons and the medulla, these axons innervate a set of cells that are part of a complex of nuclei that we call the vestibular nuclear complex. So these vestibular nuclei are found in the lateral tegmentum of the upper pons and the upper part of the medulla. Now, there are some vestibular afferents that grow directly into the cerebellum, into a part of the cerebellum that we call the floccular nodular lobe, or sometimes we refer to this cerebellar division by its functional term, the vestibulocerebellum. So when we talk about the cerebellum, we'll spend just a little bit of time talking about this special division of the cerebellum that is devoted to processing signals that are relayed along the eighth nerve as well as through the vestibular nuclei concerning our sense of balance and equilibrium. Now, one of the major functions of our vestibular nuclei in the lateral tegmentum of the brainstem is to coordinate the movements of the eyes so that we can maintain stable fixation while our head and our body are in motion. Now, I want to talk just a bit about how this happens, and this occurs via a reflex, a sensory motor reflex, called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. So before I can talk about this reflex, I just want to make sure you're aware of the 6 pairs of extraocular muscles that move the eyes in the orbit. There's the lateral rectus muscle, which abducts or abducts the eye. There is the medial rectus muscle, which adducts or adducts the eye. The eye is elevated by the actions of the superior rectus as well as the inferior oblique muscle. The eye is depressed by the actions of the inferior rectus and the superior oblique muscle. And combinations of activation of these muscles allow for all the other possible motions of the eye within the orbit. So there are 6 pairs of muscles that attach to the sclera of each eye. And these 6 muscles are under the control of 3 cranial nerves. Those cranial nerves are the abducens nerve. The abducens nerve is cranial nerve 6, and it grows out from the abducens nucleus, which is a somatic motor nucleus in the caudal part of the pons. The 6th cranial nerve innervates the lateral rectus muscle. Now, moving up into the brainstem, near the junction of the pons and the midbrain, we have our next somatic motor nucleus for eye control, and that is the trochlear nucleus. So the trochlear nucleus is found along the dorsal midline of the tegmentum, but now in the upper portion of the pons. And this is a bit of an unusual nucleus because it grows its axon to exit the dorsal aspect of the brainstem, and then as it's exiting, it actually crosses the midline and innervates the contralateral superior oblique muscle. Now, this is pretty unusual. In fact, it's a very unusual motor nerve in 2 respects. It's the only motor nerve that exits the dorsal side of the central nervous system, and it's the only motor nerve that supplies innervation to contralateral muscle. Okay, so the abducens nerve, nerve 6, does the lateral rectus, the trochlear nerve, nerve 4, does the superior oblique muscle. The rest of these extraocular muscles are innervated by axons that grow out from the ocular motor nucleus in the midbrain and send their axons through the 3rd cranial nerve. So here's our ocular motor nucleus up in the midbrain. Again, a somatic motor nucleus, so it's found along the dorsal midline of the tegmentum, but now up into the midbrain. And these axons grow out and supply the remaining muscles: the superior and inferior rectus muscles, the medial rectus muscle, and the inferior oblique.